happened soon after birth, in 1513 and 1514. Henry began to think of a divorce, or more precisely, an annulment of his marriage as invalid. Poor Catherine tried again, and in 1516 she gave birth to the future Queen Mary. Henry relented. If it was a daughter this time, he told himself, by the grace of God the sons will follow. In 1518 Catherine was delivered of another stillborn child. The disappointment of king and country was sharpened by the fact that Mary, aged 2, had already been betrothed to the Dauphin of France. If no son came to Henry, Mary would inherit the English throne, and her husband, becoming King of France, would in effect be King of England too, making Britain a province of France. The Dukes of Norfolk, Suffolk, and Buckingham had hopes of displacing Mary and securing the crown. Buckingham talked too much, was accused of treason, and was beheaded in 1521. Henry expressed fear that his sonlessness was a divine punishment for having used a papal dispensation from a biblical command. He took a vow that if the Queen would bear him a son, he would lead a crusade against the Turks. But Catherine had no further pregnancies. By 1525, all hope of additional offspring by her was abandoned. Henry had long since lost taste for her as a woman. He was now 34, in the prime of lusty manhood. She was 40, and looked older than her years. She had never been alluring, but her frequent illnesses and misfortunes had deformed her body and darkened her spirit. She excelled in culture and refinement, but husbands have seldom found erudition charming in a wife. She was a good and faithful spouse, loving her husband only next to Spain. She thought of herself as, for a time, she was, Spanish envoy, and she argued that England should always side with Ferdinand or Charles. About 1518, Henry took his first known post-marriage mistress, Elizabeth Blunt, sister of Erasmus's friend Mountjoy. She gave him a son in 1519. Henry made the boy Duke of Richmond and Somerset, and thought of entailing the succession to him. About 1524 he took another mistress, Mary Boleyn. Indeed, Sir George Throckmorton accused him to his face of adultery with Mary's mother, too. It was an unwritten law of the times that royalty, if married for reasons of state rather than choice, might seek outside of marriage the romance that had missed the legal bed. In or before 1527, Henry turned his charm upon Mary's sister Anne. Their father was Sir Thomas Boleyn, a merchant and diplomat long favoured by the king. Their mother was a Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. Anne was sent to Paris as a finishing school. There she was made a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude, then to Marguerite of Navarre, from whom she may have imbibed some Protestant leanings. Henry could have seen her as a vivacious girl of 13 at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Returning to England at 15, in 1522, she became lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. She was not strikingly beautiful. She was short, with dark complexion, broad mouth, and long neck. But Henry and others were lured by her flashing black eyes, her flowing brown hair, her grace and wit and gaiety. She had some ardent lovers, including Thomas Wyatt the poet, and Henry Percy, future Earl of Northumberland. Her enemies later charged that she had been clandestinely married to Percy before she set her sights on the king. The evidence is inconclusive. We do not know when Henry began to court her. The earliest of his extant love letters to her is conjecturally assigned to July 1527. What was the relation of this romance to Henry's petition for the annulment of his marriage? Unquestionably, he had thought of this as far back as 1514, when Anne was a girl of 7. He seems to have put the notion aside till 1524, when, according to his own account, he ceased to have conjugal relations with Catherine. The earliest recorded proceedings for an annulment were taken in March 1527, long after Henry's acquaintance with Anne, and about the time that she replaced her sister in the bosom of the king. Wolsey was apparently unaware of any royal intention to marry Anne when, in July 1527, he went to France partly to arrange a union between Henry and Renée, that daughter of Louis XII, who was soon to make a Protestant stir in Italy. The first known reference to Henry's intention is in a letter sent on August 16, 1527, by the Spanish ambassador informing Charles V of a general belief in London that if the king obtained a divorce, he would marry a daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn. This could hardly have meant Mary Boleyn, for by the end of 1527 Henry and Anne were living in neighbouring apartments under the same roof in Greenwich. We may conclude that Henry's suit for annulment was accelerated, though hardly caused, by his infatuation with Anne. The basic cause was his desire for a son, to whom he might transmit the throne with some confidence in a peaceful succession. Practically all England shared that hope. The people remembered with horror the many years, from 1454 to 1485, of war between the houses of York and Lancaster for the crown. The Tudor dynasty was but 42 years old in 1527. Its title to the throne was dubious. Only a legitimate and direct male heir to the king could continue the dynasty unchallenged. If Henry had never met Anne Boleyn, he would still have desired and deserved a divorce and an adequately fertile wife. Wolsey agreed with the king on this point and assured him that a papal annulment could be readily obtained. The papal power to grant such separations was generally accepted as a wise provision for precisely such national needs, and many precedents could be adduced. But the busy cardinal had reckoned without two disagreeable developments. Henry wanted not Renee but Anne, and the annulment would have to come from a pope who, when the problem reached him, was a prisoner of an emperor who had plentiful cause for hostility to Henry. Probably Charles would have opposed the annulment as long as his aunt resisted it, and all the more if a new marriage, such as Wolsey planned, would ally England firmly with France. The proximate cause of the English Reformation was not the climbing beauty of Anne Boleyn, but the obstinate refusal of Catherine and Charles to see the justice of Henry's desire for a son. The Catholic Queen and the Catholic Emperor collaborated with the captive Pope to divorce England from the Church. But the ultimate cause of the English Reformation was not Henry's suit for annulment so much as the rise of the English monarchy to such strength that it could repudiate the authority of the Pope over English affairs and revenues. Henry affirmed that his active desire for an annulment was occasioned by Gabriel de Gramont, who came to England in February 1527 to discuss the proposed marriage of Princess Mary with French royalty. Gramont, according to Henry, raised a question as to Mary's legitimacy on the ground that Henry's marriage with Catherine might have been invalid as violating a scriptural ban irremovable by a pope. Some have thought that Henry invented the story, but Wolsey repeated it. It was reported to the French government in 1528. It was not, so far as is known, denied by Gramont, and Gramont labored to persuade Clement that Henry's suit for annulment was just. Charles informed his ambassador in England, on July 29, 1527, that he was advising Clement to deny Henry's plea. While he was in France, Wolsey was definitely informed that Henry wished to marry not Renee but Anne. He continued to work for the annulment, but he did not hide his chagrin over Henry's choice. Bypassing his chancellor, the king, in the fall of 1527, sent his secretary, William Knight, to present two requests to the captive pope. The first was that Clement, recognizing the doubtful validity of Henry's marriage, its lack of male issue and Catherine's unwillingness to be divorced, should allow Henry to have two wives. A last-minute order from Henry deterred Knight from presenting this proposal. Henry's audacity had abated, and he must have marveled when, 3 years later, he received from Giovanni Casale, one of his agents in Rome, a letter dated September 18, 1530, saying, "A few days ago the Pope secretly proposed to me that your Majesty might be allowed 2 wives." Henry's second request was quite as strange, that the Pope should grant him a dispensation to marry a woman with whose sister the king had had sexual relations. The Pope agreed to this on condition that the marriage with Catherine should be annulled, but as to this annulment he was not yet ready to decide. Clement was not only fearful of Charles, he was reluctant to rule that a previous pope had made a serious error in validating the marriage. At the end of 1527 he received a third request, that he should appoint Wolsey and another papal legate to sit as a court in England, to hear evidence, and to pass judgment on the validity of Henry's marriage with Catherine. Clement complied on April 13, 1528, named Cardinal Campeggio to sit with Wolsey in London, and promised, in a bull to be shown only to Wolsey and Henry, to confirm whatever decision the legates should render. Probably the fact that Henry had joined Francis in January of 1528 in declaring war on Charles and pledging themselves to liberate the Pope affected Clement's compliance. Charles protested and sent to Clement a copy of a document which he claimed had been found in Spanish archives, and in which Julius II confirmed as valid the dispensation that Henry and Wolsey proposed to void. At his wit's end, the Pope, still a prisoner of Charles, rushed instructions to Campeggio not to pronounce sentence without express commission hence. If so great an injury be done to the emperor, all hope is lost of universal peace, and the Church cannot escape utter ruin, as it is entirely in the power of the emperor's servants. Delay as much as possible. On Campeggio's arrival in England in October 1528, he tried to secure Catherine's consent to retire to a nunnery. She agreed on condition that Henry should take monastic vows, but nothing could be further from Henry's mind than poverty, obedience, and chastity. However, he suggested that he would take these vows if the Pope would promise to release him from them on demand. Campeggio refused to transmit this proposal to the Pope. Instead, he reported in February 1529 the king's determination to marry Anne. "This passion," he wrote, "is a most extraordinary thing. He sees nothing, he thinks of nothing but his Anne. He cannot be without her for an hour. It moves me to pity to see how the king's life, the stability and downfall of the whole country, hang upon this one question." Changes in the military situation turned the Pope more and more against Henry's proposal. The French army that Henry had helped to finance failed in its Italian campaign, leaving the Pope completely dependent upon the Emperor. Florence expelled its ruling Medici, and Clement was as devoted to that family as Charles to the Habsburgs. Venice took advantage of the Pope's impotence to snatch Ravenna from the Papal States. Who now could rescue the papacy except its captor? "I have quite made up my mind," said Clement on June 7, 1529, "to become an imperialist and to live and die as such." On June 29th he signed the Treaty of Barcelona, by which Charles promised to restore Florence to the Medici, Ravenna to the papacy, and liberty to Clement. But one condition was that Clement would never agree to the annulment of Catherine's marriage without Catherine's free consent. On August 5th, Francis I signed the Treaty of Cambrai, which in effect surrendered Italy and the Pope to the Emperor. On May 31st, Campeggio, having delayed as long as possible, opened with Wolsey the legatine court to hear Henry's suit. Catherine, having appealed to Rome, refused to acknowledge the competence of the court. On June 21st, however, both king and queen attended. Catherine threw herself on her knees before him and made a moving plea for the continuance of their marriage. She reminded him of their many labors, her complete fidelity, her patience with his extramural sports. She took God to witness that she had been a maid when Henry married her, and she asked in what had she offended him. Henry raised her up and assured her that he wished nothing so earnestly as that their marriage had been successful. He explained that his reasons for separation were not personal, but dynastic and national, and he rejected her appeal to Rome on the ground that the Emperor controlled the Pope. She withdrew in tears and refused to take further part in the proceedings. Bishop Fisher spoke in her defense, thereby earning the enmity of the king. Henry demanded a clear decision from the court. Campeggio procrastinated skillfully, and finally, on July 23, 1529, adjourned the court for the summer vacation. To make indecision more decisive, Clement revoked the case to Rome. Henry raged. Feeling that Catherine had been unreasonably obstinate, he refused to have anything more to do with her and spent his pleasure hours openly with Anne. Probably to this period belong most of the 17 love letters that Cardinal Campeggio spirited away from England, and which the Vatican Library preserves among its literary treasures. Anne, wise in the ways of men and kings, had apparently given him as yet only encouragement and titillation. Now she complained that her youth was passing, while cardinals, who could not understand the desire of a maid for a well-to-do man, dallied over Henry's right to adorn desire with a marriage tie. She blamed Wolsey for not pressing Henry's appeal with more resolution and dispatch, and the king shared her resentment. Wolsey had done his best, though his heart was not in the matter. He had sent money to Rome to bribe the cardinals, but Charles had sent money too, and an army to boot. The cardinal had even connived at the idea of bigamy, as Luther would do a few years afterward. Yet Wolsey knew that Anne and her influential relatives were maneuvering for his fall. He tried to appease her with dainty viands and costly gifts, but her hostility grew as the annulment issue dragged on. He spoke of her as the enemy that never slept, both studied and continually imagined, both sleeping and waking, his utter destruction. He foresaw that if the annulment should be granted, Anne would be queen and would ruin him, and that if it were not granted, Henry would dismiss him as a failure and would demand an account of his stewardship in painful financial detail. The king had many reasons for dissatisfaction with his chancellor. The foreign policy had collapsed, and the turn from friendship with Charles to alliance with France had proved disastrous. Hardly a man in England now had a good word to say for the once omnicompetent cardinal. The clergy hated him for his absolute rule, the monks feared more dissolution of monasteries, the commons hated him for taking their sons and money to fight feudal wars, the merchants hated him because the war with Charles obstructed their trade with Flanders, The nobles hated him for his exactions, his upstart pride, his proliferating wealth. Some nobles, reported the French ambassador on October 17, 1529, intend, when Wolsey is dead or destroyed, to get rid of the church and spoil the goods of the church and Wolsey both. Kentish clothiers suggested that the cardinal should be installed in a leaking boat and set adrift in the sea. Henry was suppler. On October 9, 1529, one of his attorneys issued a writ summoning Wolsey to answer, before the king's judges, a charge that his acts as legate had violated the statute of Praemunire of 1392, which imposed forfeiture of goods upon any Englishman who brought papal bulls into England. It made no difference that Wolsey had secured the legatine authority at the king's request, and had used it chiefly in the king's behalf. Wolsey knew that the king's judges would convict him. He sent in to Henry a humble submission, confessing his failures, but begging him to remember also his services and his loyalty. Then he left London by a barge on the Thames. At Putney, he received a kindly message from the king. In abject gratitude, he knelt in the mud and thanked God. Henry appropriated the rich contents of the cardinal's palace at Whitehall, but allowed him to retain the Archbishopric of York and enough personal goods to require 160 horses and 72 carts to haul them to his episcopal seat. The Duke of Norfolk succeeded Wolsey as Prime Minister. Thomas More succeeded him as Chancellor in November 1529. For almost a year the fallen cardinal served as a pious and exemplary archbishop, visiting his parishes regularly, arranging the repair of churches, and acting as a trusted court of arbitration. "Who was less loved in the north than my lord the cardinal before he was amongst them?" asked a Yorkshireman, "and who better loved after he had been there a while?" But ambition reawoke in him as the fear of death subsided. He wrote letters to Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador to England. They are lost, but a report from Chapuis to Charles reads, "I have a letter from the cardinal's physician in which he tells me that his master thought the Pope should proceed to weightier censures, and should call in the secular arm," that is, excommunication, invasion, and civil war. Norfolk got wind of these exchanges, arrested Wolsey's physician, and drew from him, by means uncertain, a confession that the cardinal had advised the Pope to excommunicate the king. We do not know if the ambassador or the duke honestly reported the physician, or if the physician truthfully reported the cardinal. In any case, Henry, or the duke, ordered Wolsey's arrest. He submitted peaceably on November 4, 1530, bade farewell to his household, and set out for London. At Sheffield Park a severe dysentery confined him to bed. There the king's soldiers came with orders to conduct him to the Tower. He resumed the journey, but after 2 more days of riding he was so weak that his escort allowed him to take to bed in Leicester Abbey. To the king's officer, Sir William Kingston, he uttered the words reported by Cavendish and adapted by Shakespeare. "If I had served my God as diligently as I have done my king, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs." In Leicester Abbey, on November 29, 1530, Wolsey, aged 55, died. Chapter 24. Henry III and Thomas More, 1529 to 1535. 1. The Reformation Parliament. In the Parliament that assembled at Westminster on November 3, 1529, the controlling groups, the nobles in the upper house, the merchants and the commons, agreed on 3 policies: the reduction of ecclesiastical wealth and power, the maintenance of trade with Flanders, and support of the king in his campaign for a male heir. This did not carry with it approval of Anne Boleyn, who was generally condemned as an adventuress, nor did it prevent an almost universal sympathy with Catherine. The lower classes, politically impotent, were as yet unfavorable to the divorce, and the northern provinces, intensely Catholic, sided wholeheartedly with the Pope. Henry kept this opposition temporarily quiet by remaining orthodox in everything but the right of the popes to govern the English Church. On that point the national spirit, even stronger in England than in Germany, upheld the hand of the king, and the clergy, though horrified at the thought of making Henry their master, were not averse to independence from a papacy so obviously subject to a foreign power. About 1528, one Simon Fish published a 6-page pamphlet which Henry read without known protest, and many read with frank delight. It was called The Supplication of the Beggars, and asked the king to confiscate in whole or part the wealth of the English Church. "In the times of your noble predecessors past, there craftily crept into your realm holy and idle beggars and vagabonds, bishops, abbots, deacons, archdeacons, suffragans, priests, monks, canons, friars, pardoners, and summoners. And who is able to number this idle, ruinous sort, which, setting all labour aside, have begged so importunately that they have gotten into their hands more than a third part of all your realm? The goodliest lordships, manors, lands, and territories are theirs. Besides this, they have the 10th part of all corn, meadow, pasture, grass, wool, colts, calves, lambs, pigs, geese, and chickens. Yea, and they look so narrowly upon their profits that the poor wives must be countable to them of every 10th egg, or else she getteth not her rights at Easter. Who is she that will set her hand to work, to get 3d. a day, and may have at least 20d. a day to sleep an hour with a friar, a monk, or a priest? The nobles and merchants might have admitted some exaggeration in the indictment, but they thought it led to a charming conclusion, the secularization of church property. These lords, wrote the French ambassador Jean de Belay, intend to impeach the church and take all its goods, which it is hardly needful for me to write in cipher, for they proclaim it openly. I expect the priests will never have the Great Seal, that is, never head the government, again, and that in this Parliament they will have terrible alarms. Wolsey had held off this attack on church property, but his fall left the clergy powerless except through the declining faith of the people, and the papal authority that might have protected them by its prestige, its interdicts, or its allies, was now the main object of royal wrath and the football of imperial politics. Custom required that legislation affecting the Church in England should be passed, or require confirmation by the convocation of the clergy under the Archbishops of Canterbury and York. Could this assembly assuage the anger of the king and check the anti-clericalism of Parliament? The battle was opened by the Commons. It drew up an address to the king, professing doctrinal orthodoxy, but strongly criticizing the clergy. This famous act of accusation charged that convocation made laws without the consent of king or Parliament, seriously limiting the liberty of laymen and subjecting them to heavy censures or fines; that the clergy exacted payment for the administration of the sacraments; that the bishops gave benefices to certain young folks, calling them their nephews, and despite the youth or ignorance of such appointees; that the episcopal courts greedily exploited their right to levy fees and fines; that these courts arrested persons and imprisoned them without stating the charges against them; that they indicted and severely punished laymen upon suspicion of the slightest heresy; and the document concluded by begging the king for the reformation of these ills. Henry, who may have been privy to the composition of this address, submitted its main points to the convocation and asked for an answer. The bishops admitted some abuses, which they attributed to occasional individuals. They affirmed the justice of their courts, and they looked to the pious king, who had so nobly rebuked Luther, to aid them in suppressing heresy. Then, grievously mistaking the royal temper, they added warlike words. "Forasmuch as we repute and take our authority of making the laws to be grounded upon the Scriptures of God and the determination of Holy Church, we may not submit the execution of our charges and duty, certainly prescribed to us by God, to your Highness's assent. With all humility we therefore beseech your grace to maintain and defend such laws and ordinances as we, by the authority of God, shall for his honor make, to the edification of virtue and the maintaining of Christ's faith." The issue was joined. Henry did not meet it at once. His first interest was to get Parliament's approval for a strange request, that he be excused from repaying the loans that had been made to him by his subjects. The Commons protested and consented. 3 other bills were introduced, which aimed to check the authority of the clergy over the probate of wills, their exaction of death taxes, and their holding of plural benefices. These bills were passed by the Commons. They were passionately opposed by the bishops and abbots sitting in the upper house. They were amended, but in essence they were made law. Parliament adjourned on December 17th. During the summer of 1530, the king received some costly encouragement. Thomas Cranmer, a doctor of divinity at Cambridge, suggested to Henry that the major universities of Europe should be polled on the question whether a pope could permit a man to marry his brother's widow. A merry game of rival bribery ensued. Henry's agents scattered money to induce negative judgments. Charles's agents used money or threats to secure affirmative replies. The Italian answers were divided. The Lutheran universities refused any comfort to the defender of the faith, but the University of Paris, under pressure by Francis, gave the answer so doubly dear to the king. Oxford and Cambridge, after receiving stern letters from the government, approved Henry's right to have his marriage annulled. So strengthened, he issued through his Attorney General in December 1530 a notice that the government intended to prosecute, as violators of the Praemunire statute, all clergymen who had recognized Wolsey's legatine power. When Parliament and Convocation reassembled on January 16, 1531, the king's agents happily announced to the clergy that the prosecution would be withdrawn if they would confess their guilt and pay a fine of £118,000, or about $11,800,000. They protested that they had never wanted Wolsey to have such power, and had recognized him as legate only because the king had done so in the trial of his suit before Wolsey and Campeggio. They were quite right, of course, but Henry sorely needed money. They mournfully agreed to raise the sum from their congregations. Feeling his oats, the king now demanded that the clergy should acknowledge him as the protector and only supreme head of the church and clergy of England. That is, that they should end their allegiance to the Pope. They offered a dozen compromises, tried a dozen ambiguous phrases. Henry was merciless and insisted on yes or no. Finally, on February 10, 1531, Archbishop Warham, now 81, reluctantly proposed the king's formula with a saving clause, "so far as the law of Christ permits." The Convocation remained silent. The silence was taken as consent. The formula became law. Mollified, the king now allowed the bishops to prosecute heretics. Parliament and Convocation adjourned again on March 30, 1531. In July, Henry left Catherine at Windsor, never to see her again. Soon thereafter, she was removed to Ampthill, while Princess Mary was lodged at Richmond. The jewels that Catherine had worn as queen were required of her by Henry, who gave them to Anne Boleyn. Charles V protested to Clement, who addressed a brief to the king on January 25, 1532, rebuking him for adultery and exhorting him to dismiss Anne and keep Catherine as his lawful queen until decision should be given on his application for annulment. Henry ignored the rebuke and pursued his romance. About this time he wrote one of his tender missives to Anne. "Mine own sweetheart, this shall be to advertise you of the great loneliness, that I find here since your departure. For I assure you, methinketh the time longer since your departing now last than I was wont to do a whole fortnight. I think your kindness and my fervence of love causeth it. But now that I am coming toward you, methinketh my pains by half released, in wishing myself, especially in evening, in my sweetheart's arms, whose pretty duckies, breasts, I trust shortly to kiss. Written with the hand of him that was, is, and shall be yours by his will, H.R." When Parliament and Convocation reconvened, on January 15, 1532, Henry secured from all four houses further anti-clerical legislation. The clerics under the degree of subdeacon, when charged with felony, should be tried by civil courts, that fees and fines in ecclesiastical courts should be reduced, that ecclesiastical death dues and probate fees should be lowered or abolished, that the annats, the first year's revenues of a newly appointed prelate, should no longer be paid to the Pope, and that the transfer of English funds to Rome for dispensations, indulgences, and other papal services should cease. A sly hint was sent to the Curia that the annats would be restored to the Pope if the marriage with Catherine should be annulled. By this time a majority of the bishops had been won over to the view that they would not lose in authority or revenue if the English Church were independent of Rome. In March 1532 the Convocation announced its readiness to separate from the papacy. "May it please your grace to cause the said unjust exactions to cease, and in case the Pope will make process against this realm for the attaining these annats, may it please your Highness to ordain in the present Parliament that the obedience of your Highness and of the people be withdrawn from the see of Rome." And on May 15th the Convocation presented to the king a pledge to submit all its subsequent legislation to a committee, half laymen, half clergymen, empowered to veto any ordinances which it should judge injurious to the realm. So, in this epochal Reformation Parliament and Convocation, the Church of England was born and became an arm and subject of the state. On May 16th, Thomas More, having failed to stem the anti-clerical tide, resigned as Chancellor and retired to his home. In August, Archbishop Warham died after dictating a deathbed repudiation of the Convocation's submission to the king. Henry replaced More with Thomas Audley and Warham with Thomas Cranmer. the revolution proceeded. In February 1533, Parliament enacted a statute of appeals by which all litigation that had formerly been sent for judgment to Rome was henceforth to be decided in the spiritual and temporal courts within the realm, without regard to any foreign inhibition, excommunication, or interdict. On January 15, 1533, Henry married Anne, who was already 4 months pregnant. The king had now urgent reasons for the annulment of his union with Catherine. Having made without result another appeal to the Pope, he secured from Convocation an approval of his divorce in April 1533. On May 23, Cranmer, as Archbishop of Canterbury, declared the marriage with Catherine unlawful and void, and on May 28 he pronounced Anne to be Henry's lawful wife. 3 days later, Anne, in brocade and jewels, rode to her coronation as Queen of England in a stately pageant designed by tradition and Hans Holbein the Younger. Amid the exaltation, she noticed the disapproving silence of the crowd, and she may have wondered how long her uneasy head would wear the crown. Pope Clement pronounced the new marriage null, and its future offspring illegitimate, and excommunicated the king on July 11, 1533. On September 7th, Elizabeth was born. Charles's ambassador reported to him that the king's mistress had given birth to a bastard. Parliament, which had adjourned on May 4th, resumed its sittings on January 15, 1534. Annats and other papal revenues were now definitely appropriated to the crown, and the appointment of bishops became in law, as already in practice, a prerogative of the king. Indictments for heresy were removed from clerical to civil jurisdiction. In 1533, Elizabeth Barton, a nun of Kent, announced that she had received orders from God to condemn the king's remarriage, and had been allowed to see the place that was being prepared for Henry in hell. The royal court put her through a severe examination, and drew from her a confession that her divine revelations were impostures, and that she had permitted others to use them in a conspiracy to overthrow the king. She and 6 accomplices were tried by the House of Lords, were judged guilty, and were executed on May 5, 1534. Bishop Fisher was accused of having known of the conspiracy and of having failed to warn the government. It was also charged that he and Catherine had been privy to a plan, conceived by Chapuis and discouraged by Charles, for an invasion of England to coincide with an insurrection of Catherine's supporters. Fisher denied the charges, but remained under suspicion of treason. Henry's most aggressive agent in these affairs was Thomas Cromwell. Born in 1485, the son of a Putney blacksmith, he grew up in poverty and hardship, and wandered for years, as practically a vagabond, through France and Italy. Back in England, he entered the textile business, became a moneylender, and made a fortune. He served Wolsey faithfully for 5 years, defended him in adversity, and earned Henry's respect for his industry and loyalty. He was made successively Chancellor of the Exchequer, Master of the Rolls, and, in May 1534, Secretary to the King. From 1531 to 1540, he was the chief administrator of the government as an obedient executor of the royal will. His aristocratic enemies, who despised him as a parvenu symbol of their rising rivals, the businessmen, accused him of practicing the principles of Machiavelli's prince, of accepting bribes, of selling offices, of inordinately loving wealth and power. His aim, which he hardly sought to disguise, was to make the king supreme over every phase of English life, and to finance an absolute monarchy with the confiscated wealth of the Church. In pursuing his purposes he showed consummate and unscrupulous ability, multiplied his fortune, and won every battle except the last. It was probably at his suggestion and through his manipulation that Henry, disturbed by increasing hostility among the people, persuaded Parliament to pass an Act of Succession on March 30, 1534, which declared the marriage with Catherine invalid, transformed Mary into a bastard, named Elizabeth heiress to the throne unless Anne should have a son, and made it a capital crime for any person to question the validity of Anne's marriage to Henry or the legitimacy of their offspring. All Englishmen and women were by act required to take an oath of loyalty to the king. Royal commissioners, supported by soldiery, rode through the country, entered homes, castles, monasteries, and convents, and exacted the oath. Only a few refused it. Among these were Bishop Fisher and Thomas More. They offered to swear to the succession, but not to the other contents of the act. They were committed to the Tower. Finally, the Parliament voted the decisive Statute of Supremacy on November 11, 1534. This reaffirmed the king's sovereignty over church and state in England, christened the new national church Ecclesia Anglicana, and gave the king all those powers over morals, organization, heresy, creed, and ecclesiastical reform which had heretofore belonged to the Church. The act made it treason to speak or write of the king as a usurper, tyrant, schismatic, heretic, or infidel. A new oath was required of all bishops that they would accept the civil and ecclesiastical supremacy of the king without the reservation so far as the law of Christ allows, and would never in the future consent to any resumption of papal authority in England. All the forces of the government were deployed to paralyze the opposition to these unprecedented decrees. The secular clergy generally pretended to submit. Many monks and friars, owing a direct allegiance to the Pope, shied away from the oaths, and their resistance shared in the king's later decision to close the monasteries. Henry and Cromwell were especially incensed by the obstinacy of the friars in the Charterhouse, a Carthusian monastery in London. 3 Carthusian priors came to Cromwell to explain their reluctance to acknowledge any layman as head of the Church in England. Cromwell sent them to the Tower. On April 26, 1535, they, with another friar and a secular priest, were tried by the king's judges, who were for pardoning them. But Cromwell, fearing that lenience would encourage wider resistance, demanded a verdict of guilty, and the judges yielded. On May 3rd, all 5 men, still refusing to accept the act of supremacy, were dragged on hurdles to Tyburn, and one after another was hanged, cut down alive, disemboweled, and dismembered. One severed arm was hung over the entrance arch of the Charterhouse to instruct the remaining friars, but none withdrew his refusal. 3 were put in the Tower. They were fastened to uprights by irons around their necks and feet, and were forced to stand in that position for 17 days, fed but never loosed for any natural need. The remaining Carthusians, still obdurate, were dispersed among other monasteries, with the exception of 10 who were imprisoned in Newgate. 9 of these died of prison, fever, and filth. Henry was now the sole judge of what, in religion and politics, the English people were to believe. Since his theology was still Catholic in every respect except the papal power, he made it a principle to persecute impartially Protestant critics of Catholic dogma and Catholic critics of his ecclesiastical supremacy. Indeed, the prosecution of heresy had continued and would continue all through his reign. In 1531, by order of Chancellor More, Thomas Bilney was burned for speaking against religious images, pilgrimages, and prayers for the dead. James Bainham was arrested for holding that Christ was only spiritually present in the Eucharist. He was tortured to draw from him the names of other heretics. He held fast and was burned at Smithfield in April 1532. 2 others were burned in that year, and the Bishop of Lincoln offered an indulgence of 40 days to good Christians who would carry a faggot to feed the fire. This reign of terror reached its apex in the prosecution of Fisher and More. Erasmus had described the Bishop of Rochester as a person loaded with every virtue. But Fisher had himself been guilty of persecution, and he had joined the Spanish ambassador in urging Charles to invade England and depose Henry. In law, he had committed treason to the state, which could not excuse him on the plea that he had been loyal to the Church. The new pontiff, Paul III, made the mistake of naming the imprisoned bishop a cardinal. Though Fisher declared that he had not sought the honor, Henry interpreted the appointment as a challenge. On June 17, 1535, the bishop, now in his 80th year, was given a final trial and again refused to sign the oath acknowledging Henry as head of the English Church. On June 22nd, he was led to a block on Tower Hill. A long, lean body, an eyewitness described him, nothing in a manner but skin and bones, so that the most part that there saw him marveled to see any man bearing life to be so far consumed. On the scaffold he received an offer of pardon if he would take the oath. He refused. His severed head was hung upon London Bridge. It might now, if it could, said Henry, go to Rome and get its cardinal's hat. But a more troublesome recusant remained. 2. The Utopian. The father of Thomas More was a successful lawyer and prominent judge. Thomas received his education at St. Anthony's School in London, was farmed out as a page to Archbishop Morton, and was by him confirmed in orthodoxy, integrity, and a cheerful piety. Morton predicted, we are told, that this child here waiting at table will prove a marvelous man. At 15, the youth went to Oxford, and was soon so fascinated with classical literature that his father, to save the youth from becoming an impecunious scholar, pulled him out of the university and sent him to study law in London. Oxford and Cambridge still aimed at preparing students for an ecclesiastical career. New Inn and Lincoln's Inn trained the men who were now taking over from the clergy the government of England. Only 8 members of the House of Commons in the Reform Parliament of 1529-37 had received a university education, while a rising proportion were lawyers and businessmen. In 1499, aged 21, More met Erasmus and was charmed into Humanism. Their friendship is one of the fragrant essences of the time. They were both given to a measured merriment, and salted their studies with laughing satire. They shared a distaste for scholastic philosophy, whose subtleties, said More, were as profitable as milking a he-goat into a sieve. They both hoped for a reform of the Church from within, avoiding a violent disruption of religious unity and historical continuity. More was not the peer of Erasmus in learning or tolerance. Indeed, his customary gentleness and generosity were sometimes interrupted by strong passions, even by bigotry. In controversy, he stooped now and then, like nearly all his contemporaries, to fierce invective and bitter vituperation. But he was the superior of Erasmus in courage, sense of honor, and devotion to a cause. The letters that they exchanged are a precious testimony to the graces of an ungracious age. "Farewell," ends one of More's, "sweetest Erasmus, dearer to me than my eyes." He was one of the most religious men of the century, shaming with his laic piety the worldliness of ecclesiastics like Wolsey. At 23, when he was already advanced in the study of law, he thought of becoming a priest. He gave public lectures in 1501 on Augustine's City of God, and such older pundits as Grocyn sat in his audience. Though he criticized the monks for shirking their rule, he fervently admired the sincere monastic state, and sometimes regretted that he had not chosen it. For a long time he wore a horsehair shirt next to his skin. Now and then it drew enough blood to visibly stain his clothing. He believed in miracles and saintly legends, therapeutic relics, religious images, and pilgrimages, and wrote devotional works to the medieval tune that life is a prison, and that the aim of religion and philosophy should be to prepare us for death. He married twice and brought up several children in a Christian discipline at once sober and cheerful, with frequent prayer, mutual love, and complete trust in Providence. The manor house in Chelsea, to which he moved in 1523, was famous for its library and gallery, and its gardens extending for 100 yards down to the Thames. At 26 in 1504 he was chosen a burgess delegate to Parliament. There he argued so successfully against a measure proposed by Henry VII that the king briefly imprisoned and heavily fined the senior More as a devious means of teaching the young orator the comforts of conformity. At the close of that Parliament, More returned to private life and prospered in the practice of law. In 1509 he was persuaded to take the office of under-sheriff in the city, that is, ancient London north of the Thames. His functions, suiting his temperament, were judicial rather than adventurous. His judgments earned him wide renown for wisdom and impartiality, and his polite refusal of presents from litigants violated time-dishonored precedents that were still vigorous in Francis Bacon's day. Soon he was back in Parliament, and by 1515 he was Speaker of the House of Commons. In a famous letter to Houghton on July 23, 1517, Erasmus described More as of medium height, pale complexion, auburn hair, careless of dress or formality, abstemious in food and drink, cheerful with quick humor and ready smile, inclined to jokes and pranks, and keeping in his house a jester, a monkey, and many minor animal pets. All the birds in Chelsea came to him to be fed. A faithful husband, a loving and idolized father, a persuasive orator, a judicious counselor, a man alert with charity and friendly offices. In short, concluded this font sketch, what did nature ever create milder, sweeter, and happier than the genius of Thomas More? He found time to write books. This book is continued on Cassette 8, Side 1.